Well, today marks exactly 10 years since medical assistance in dying became legal in Canada. And on this anniversary, a parliamentary committee is recommending a pause on its expansion to include mental illnesses, a decision that has sparked debate over Canadian safety versus constitutional rights. This committee's report finds that this divergence of perspectives persists. Some witnesses asserted that Canada is or will be ready for the expected expansion on the 17th of March 2027. Others stated that the conditions for proceeding have yet to be met. For some, the expansion should never proceed under any circumstances. Many recognized that these issues are difficult, challenging, and consequential for Canadians. Conservative MP Michael Cooper is a member of that parliamentary committee that wrestled with some of these issues. Mr. Cooper, thank you very much for coming in.
Great to be here.
This fundamentally what we were hearing from people who suffer from mental illness only and wanted access to a doctor's help to die was, I am suffering much as people who are irremediably suffering physically are, thus I should have access to this same procedure. Why is it that you've come to the conclusion that those two things should not be equal, essentially?
Well, the overwhelming evidence is that MAID for mental illness cannot be carried out safely. And there are two fundamental clinical issues that remain unresolved and won't be resolved for the foreseeable future. And that is, first of all, that it's difficult, if not impossible, to accurately predict irremediability. And what that means is that persons who could get better, who could go on to lead healthy and happy lives, would have their lives prematurely ended if this expansion went forward. And secondly, it is difficult to accurately distinguish a rational request for MAID versus one motivated by suicidal ideation in the context of mental illness. And that's underscored by the fact that in about 90% of suicides, mental illness is a factor.
There is a group of dissenting senators. There were a couple of dissenting reports, and we should just clarify for folks, because this is it's a big committee, 17 people, Liberals, Conservatives, going in the same direction on this. But we're going to hear from the other side of the equation in a minute. And those dissenting senators essentially suggest you went about the work in the wrong way. They call the process deeply flawed. They say of the 44 witnesses that this committee heard from, more than 2/3 were already publicly opposed to opening up MAID to people with mental illness only. They point to specific folks like the Canadian Psychiatry Association who wanted to testify. They weren't invited to testify. Why not be open to hearing more opinions different from your own? Because you have long held your views on this. Well, why not hear more dissenting opinions?
We heard a wide range of opinions, and the senators had a proportionate number of witnesses. We heard many witnesses from the senators' lists, but the witnesses that we heard from, overwhelmingly, who are psychiatrists, who are experts, said that this cannot be done safely, including the chair of the Association of Chairs of Psychiatry, who represents all 17 chairs of psychiatry at Canada's medical schools. There's nothing close to a consensus. We heard evidence that you would be better off flipping a coin in terms of accurately predicting irremediability. We're talking about life and death. We're talking about literally gambling with people's lives if this expansion were to go forward. So in the face of that, there is only one course of action to take, and that is for the government to move forward with legislation to put an indefinite pause on this ill-advised, ill-thought-out expansion, but should never have happened in the first place had the government followed the evidence and the facts instead of rushing into this by an 11th hour an amendment to Bill C-7 back in 2021, which set this whole train in motion.
Which, to remind folks, this is a couple of times now that the government has said, oh, we will offer this access, but they have to postpone it, and now we have this new conclusion. We're going to get to the path forward in a minute, but I just want to stay with this thought about the evidence you heard and the people on both sides of this debate. We have a statement from Claire Brosseau. She's a woman who suffers from mental illness. She'd been hoping to access MAID. Dying with Dignity provided us this statement. She wanted to testify before your committee. She didn't. She says of the committee you are part of, they believe our perspective isn't relevant and that I'm not a reliable witness to my own life. Clearly, my judgment and account of my suffering is suspect. We're not worthy of being spoken to or even acknowledged. I don't think they understand that for us, winning is devastating and losing is dangerous. What would you say to her?
Well, I would say what's dangerous is to move ahead with this expansion. in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's like flipping a coin with people's lives. And I understand her strong views about this, and I respect those views. But we had a limited time as a committee to hear from witnesses. We would have liked more meetings. But look, I've been on this committee for years, and this is the third time we've had hearings, and the evidence overwhelmingly is the same because these two clinical issues remain the same. And for the Liberals, the question is, how many times can they bring in emergency legislation? They've done it twice, and I think that kicking the can down the road a third time isn't going to resolve these issues. So, look, it's a complicated issue, but when it comes to persons who are suffering from mental health, the message that needs to be sent is to provide persons who are struggling, we need to give them help and hope. And there are gaps in terms of mental health supports that need to be closed, and we need to work on that.
An important point, and I don't know that it's one that necessarily gets a lot of attention in this debate. I do, though, want to talk about what is going to be done about this particular issue. You're very clear in the dissenting report from the Conservatives. You do not want this expansion to ever take place. The Liberal chair was a bit more circumspect, I would say, in his additional report, and he said, not for now, but perhaps this issue could be re-examined if the consensus changed, if it's easier to put safeguards in place. Why close that door permanently? Why do you not take his position that maybe one day we can return to this discussion?
Well, my position is put an indefinite pause. That is his position. That is the recommendation of the committee in the face of a deadline in which the sunset clause expires on March 17th of next year. So if legislation isn't introduced to do that, then it will go forward. And by the way, there is a clear path for the government to move forward to put an indefinite pause, and that's with Tamara Jansen's private member's bill C-218, which will be debated and if it passes the House at committee in September. So that's a path forward.
And you've been, again, you're very clear in the report that you want the Liberals to pick up this private member's bill and have that be the path through this. But let's take a step back. That assumes that the Liberals are going to look at this report and say, we're on side with what the committee has decided. Justice Minister Sean Fraser has said they want to take some time, look at it. They're going to examine this in the coming weeks. How confident do you feel that the Liberals are going to take the advice of the majority in this case?
Well, I hope that Sean Fraser follows the evidence and makes a decision based upon the evidence, recognizing that we are talking about life and death, and we are talking about some of the most vulnerable persons in Canadian society.
Do you feel that people around the table don't recognize that? Like, I take your point, but do you not feel that everybody engaged in this debate politically understands it's life and death, but just takes different positions on what's best?
Certainly, but okay. But I would say that when you can't accurately predict whether someone is going to get better, when someone could get better and have their life prematurely ended, when it's like flipping a coin, moving ahead with this at the current time is reckless and dangerous.
10 years today since the legislation passed to open up medical access, medical assistance in dying to Canadians, more than 100,000 people who have used this to end their life. Do you support where the line is now? Not the expansions we're talking about, but are you comfortable with where things are? Or do you feel that if the Conservatives were to form government in future, there should be some backing off of where we've gotten to?
We need to ensure that safeguards are properly enforced. There have been widely reported cases of vulnerable persons who have fallen through the cracks due to social vulnerabilities, due to a lack of adequate housing, due to other issues. And so we need to ensure that the safeguards that are in place are adequate and that they are being consistently enforced across Canada. There's some questions about that. And we also need to see that there is better data collection, better reporting, and better monitoring. So there's work to do.
Okay, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today, Conservative MP Michael Cooper.
We're going to take the time to digest the report. At minimum, over the next few weeks, it'll largely be understanding the recommendations that the committee made and the reasons that they landed on those recommendations. From there, we'll have to determine as a government the right path forward, but I don't have a date for you.
Senator Kristopher Wells is a member of the committee. You were one of the authors of a dissenting report, so taking a very different perspective from what we just heard from Michael Cooper. I want to talk to you about some of the issues that certainly the Conservatives raised, but the Liberals as well, many members of this committee. When they were faced with this question of whether or not to expand access to people whose sole condition is mental illness, they said it's too hard to determine whether somebody is irredeemably ill, and it is too hard to distinguish suicidality from a MAID request. Those are two reasons that got pointed to a lot. What do you make of that reasoning for saying that this just can't be ethically, comfortably, safely expanded at this moment?
Well, certainly I don't agree with that reasoning, and partly because we didn't hear from the right people at the committee. It was incredibly flawed, it was biased, and to be able to come with those assertions, well, you better have the evidence that backs it up, and we didn't hear that. In fact, it was deliberately excluded some of the foremost experts in the world on this issue, and so you have to ask the reasoning, why is that? Why was the committee manipulated in such a way, right, that compromises the integrity of any report or any recommendation? Like, most obviously, the Canadian Psychiatric Association that was charged with developing the guidelines were not invited to present towards the committee, despite many committee members repeatedly suggesting that they be on the table, and that they had to write their own letter to rebut the testimony that they were hearing because they were so concerned.
So we put those concerns, specifically the numbers that you put in this report, to Mr. Cooper just a few minutes ago. He said, listen, what we heard reflected what he believes is the consensus out there. He pointed to specific witnesses who represent, for instance, the chairs of psychiatry across the country. He says, we feel that we got the information we needed.
The chairs of psychiatry that's an administrative position. It doesn't give expertise, on these issues. So there's, again, a clear misrepresentation that happens here. I don't know how you can say that when on an issue of such national importance, people's very life and death circumstances, that we don't take the time to have the right experts, have a very fair and balanced hearing, to then be able to make the determinations. I think, Minister Fraser has already called the whole committee into question himself by saying that he's not going to just blanket accept the report. He's actually going to go back and look at the evidence and the testimony, and I would encourage him to even go further. He needs to meet directly with the Canadian Psychiatric Association, people with lived experience who were not allowed to testify, like Claire Brosseau herself.
And we did quote her to Mr. Cooper in the previous interview, somebody who would like access to MAID and has had, as she describes it, a very difficult life for many, many years now. You said a few interesting things there, though, Senator Wells, that I'd like to get to the bottom of, both about the Justice Minister and what you think is going to happen next. But first, you're suggesting that the testimony that was offered was manipulated. To what end? By whom? Like, what is it you're suggesting happened here?
Well, there was clear bias at play. And it's been well reported and documented, the imbalance of the witnesses in terms of their perspectives and various levels of expertise. As I already mentioned, how could you have the foremost organization that actually does speak on behalf of Canadian psychiatrists, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, not be allowed to come before the committee and share testimony?
But are you saying that the political parties were seeking a particular outcome, or what?
That appears to be the case, and I can say that as an independent senator who doesn't have a vote that's whipped. We know that some committee members from the political parties resigned because they were so upset with the committee, and they were just simply replaced. So, this maybe won't make me popular with the government, but that's why we're here at the Senate, and we focus on the evidence and the credibility and the time and the rigor to get things right on very important issues to Canadians.
So we're deep into the politics here, and I actually want to go up for a minute and just think about this from the level of the average Canadian who is trying to make sense of this issue. People have passionate views on both sides. You're saying, well, there are a bunch of folks who would have said, no, this can be safely done. But if there are still a significant portion, and we can sort of debate or what the percentage is, I don't know, of medical practitioners who say this is a tough issue, given that this is a widespread process across the country, how can Canadians feel comfortable that even if a significant chunk, even if they don't represent the majority of medical practitioners, aren't comfortable with this, that we should still go ahead?
Well, you just look back to past history. There was no unanimity and consensus when we were dealing with the issue of abortion. Now that is standard practice and something we're very proud of in Canada, to stand up for women's right to choose. And this is fundamentally also about choice. And look, those medical practitioners who don't want to provide MAID, no one is compelling them to do so. But there are many who feel amply qualified and ready to deliver this essential healthcare service, and we shouldn't be standing in the way. And no one is compelling, the government isn't compelling provinces that do not agree with this to enact it. But there are provinces that are ready, there are professionals who are ready, and people should have the same right as anyone else.
You want the Supreme Court to weigh in on this. The clock is ticking, though, right? If indeed the government is going to follow the advice here, they have to pass a new law to change the criminal code. What makes you think that the government would be willing to take your advice and move this along to the Supreme Court?
Well, I think we owe it to Canadians. We've done that in the past on socially divisive issues. Same-sex marriage 21 years ago, the government asked for a reference to the Supreme Court. We need to make this the law of the land all across the country, and we need to really deal with the legal issues. Why are some people's charter rights being denied and others are being accepted to enter into a choice over, if they qualify, of course, to enter into medical assistance in dying? It's just this one small group that is dealing with the extreme anguish related to a mental illness that saying they don't have charter rights. Look, the other important thing to say is this issue was settled by Parliament 6 years ago. The issue we were to be investigating at the committee was only system readiness. My worry is that we move with this repeal. What's next? We've heard from some members of political parties that they want to repeal all of MAID. And people might not think that's even possible.
Well, I will say we asked Mr. Cooper, who has been a very strong voice on this, about the lines, and he certainly did not go that far a few minutes ago. But I imagine it's his political party you're talking about, since they've been the most staunch about this.
Well, perhaps, but people said that about abortion in the United States, and now Roe versus Wade was overturned, right? And we start to things, rolling back. So, I think this is a concern that Canadians could have. Maybe it's a small possibility. But I think, once the door is reopened and once we're moving backwards, we're not moving forward on this issue. We're actually moving backwards. We're going to repeal something that's already in place.
Let me just ask you then, in closing, we only have a minute here. Sure. Supreme Court reference, your feelings about your interpretation of what the Justice Minister has said. The Liberals on this committee were pretty clear about what they think. So what makes you think that the governing party is willing to go down the path that you have presented?
Well, I think the governing party also needs to listen to the will of Canadians. When you look at the polling, overwhelmingly in favor of MAID and, in favor of MAID to absolutely to smaller numbers for those who are suffering from mental illness, right? Canadians in some ways are ahead of the government on this issue, perhaps as they always have been on socially complex issues. But I think the big thing we need to take out of this, we need to remove the partisan politics and we need to get this issue right. And that needs further study, listening from all of the experts, getting all of those opinions on the table. I would encourage the Justice Minister and the Prime Minister to do exactly that, because this committee did not do that.
Okay, we are going to leave the conversation there, although, as you point to, the debate is not over yet and the decision has not been made by the government. But thank you for this conversation, Senator Kristopher Wells.
Thank you.